We're going to be joined by several people who will tell you about this map and several of the cases highlighted in the map. But first, I just want to point out that this is an event that's sponsored by EJAtlas, Environmental Justice Atlas, the Debt Observatory and Globalization, Citizens Observatory for Green Deal Financing, CRAAD-OI from Madagascar, and my very own Foreign Policy in Focus. I'd like to encourage people to use the chat to introduce yourselves. Tally Noman has started the process, so please turn to your chat and introduce yourselves and tell us where you're from so we get a chance to see where people are tuning in from all over the world. I'm going to do a very, very short introduction to rare earth elements in 5 slides. And then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers, and I'll introduce the speakers one at a time. I'm going to share my screen, if I can find the right one. There we go. Rare earth elements. As many of you know, rare earth elements are these that are highlighted. Whoops, I skipped ahead there. Highlighted in orange. They're a group of metals. They're not rare. They're spread all over the world, though it can be difficult to extract them. These metals share certain properties that make them quite valuable in especially advanced technology and applications, which we'll be talking about today. As I said, they're not particularly rare. They are concentrated in the following countries. As you see, there's an enormous amount in China, and China, of course, is responsible for extracting about 70%, producing about 70% right now of rare earth elements, and processing about 85%. But you see that there are quite a few resources available in countries like Brazil, Russia, India, Vietnam. You see the production of rare earth elements was dominated by the United States up through the mid-1980s, and then China not only enters the market, but begins to dominate the market, as I said. The demand for rare earth elements is going to be rising, as we see from this graph, and I understand Alphonse will give a little bit more detail about this. And you can see that with the straight blue line, that even if it were just without applications in wind power and electric vehicles, we would see rising demand for rare earth elements. But the addition of these key elements of a quote-unquote clean energy transition will see a rapid increase in demand. And as you see, there are many uses of rare earths, some of them quite conventional, in such things as water treatment and fluorescent lighting, but the focus on rare earths recently has been because of their applications in advanced technologies related to electric vehicles, windmills, in large part because of the magnets that they are used for. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Mariana Walter, who's from EJAtlas, Environmental Justice Atlas. She's a postdoctoral researcher and member of the Direction and Coordination Group of the Environmental Justice Atlas. Each of the speakers will have 10 minutes. You can make comments about their talks in the chat. You can put your questions in the Q&A. And as I said, each of the speakers will have 10 minutes. I'm going to turn off my video. When I turn my video on, that means the speaker has 1 more minute. And if they get to 10 minutes, I show them not the red card, not the yellow card, but the green card. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Mariana. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John, and thank you all of you for coming today to learn more about the feature map that, as John said, you can actually access. Here is an image of this collaborative map that we have developed as John mentioned. So I will explain a bit more about the motivations behind the map and some of the results, the findings of the mapping we did. So, wait, let me see. Okay, so as John was mentioning, rare earth elements are really critical for many energy transition, digitalization, also for aerospace and military uses, but are not really well known. But as John also showed, the demand is going high very quickly. And with this collaborative mapping, we aim to document what was happening globally across the supply chain of rare earth elements, examine and make more visible how the increasing pressure to access rare earth elements is taking place on the ground. So we, with different grassroots organizations, networks, also researchers and interns and different collaborators, we trace different conflicts taking place at the extraction, processing, and also recycling or even e-waste management locations around the world, and what was happening there, and the different conflicts and the different impacts that these rare earth elements were generating globally. So we identified 25 cases of socio-environmental conflicts in more than 18 countries. These are by no means all existing conflicts related with the rare earth elements. And this is actually an ongoing process of mapping. And during the next month and next year, we will also expand the mapping. So as you can see, we have conflicts in 18 countries from China, which is actually where most of the extraction and processing is taking place globally, but there's also conflicts taking place in Africa, Latin America, North America, and even Europe, and actually in all over the world. So we have identified some common trends that are present in different of the mapping conflicts. One, that we want to highlight has to do with the violence and criminalization and human rights abuses that we see are more and more frequent in this commodity extraction frontier, but also in the processing and recycling stages of the rare earth element supply chain. So we identify lack of recognition of the rights of local communities and indigenous communities, and also different forms of violence against environmental defenders, like direct threats, intimidations, false accusations, and repression. One of the cases we have documented is taking place in Myanmar, which is a dictatorship, where illegal mining is taking place with the support of local militias and government, and there's significant levels of violence involved. But one of the main concerns of local communities has also to do with the environmental and health impacts of rare earth elements extraction, processing, and what happens with the final disposal of the products. So rare earth elements have some particularities. They are found in low concentration, which means that large amount of ores are processed to obtain very small amounts of rare earth elements, and large piles of waste are generated. Another particularity of rare earth elements has to do with that rare earth elements often coincide with radioactive and hazardous elements such as thorium and uranium. This means that the mining, beneficiation, separation, and refining are often the source of hazardous waste and pollutants to water, soil, air, and human health. And another particularity has to do with the often combined presence of rare earth element, which means that large amounts of energy and chemicals are required to separate the rare earth elements to use them individually in different products. So as you will see in the interactive map that you can explore and read the different cases and how in each one of these cases different impacts are highlighted by communities, we have cases taking place at the mining stage, like in Bayan Obo, which is the largest extraction and processing site on Earth of rare earth elements. Also, we have relevant cases taking place at the processing stage, as we will hear more from Litan later today, what's happening in Malaysia in relation with LINAS rare earth elements operations. And we also document cases related with the final disposal of electronic waste and different recycling industries, such as in China and Ghana, which are some of the cases that you will find in the map, and maybe you won't find in this specific map, but are taking place globally. The water overconsumption of earth element related activities and the competition with local uses is also very frequent in the cases we have documented. And the overlap of extraction projects, earth extraction projects with protected areas and biodiversity hotspots. We have, this is happening in many of the cases we have documented in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, or Europe, as you can read here in the PowerPoint. And there's also rare earth elements impacts related with sand mining in India, for instance, where there's relevant impacts in coastal areas and coastal ecosystems. Rare earth elements, we have documented at least 2 cases with rare earth elements are present in deep sea mining projects in New Zealand and Norway, particularly, which is currently a very important debate worldwide about the impacts that this type of mining could have on the ocean and on the many uncertain and sensitive impacts. We also highlight, and everything I'm mentioning here will be, it's also written in a report that we will be launching in a couple of days, where you will be able to read all of this in English, Spanish, and French. So we also invite you to check the websites to read the full report. We also identify impacts related with traditional livelihoods of local communities, impacts on sacred places of communities and their cultures. So indigenous communities are involved in many of the areas in conflict we have documented, and the areas where projects are being developed are places where communities have sacred spaces, but there's also the ecosystems and the territories where communities hunt or gather traditional medicines. And we have cases in many countries documented this concerning trend. Something that we also find in most of the documented cases has to do with the lack of information and public consultation to local communities. So communities receive little or no information about the projects, which is preventing meaningful local participation, and in the case of indigenous communities, the violation of their free, prior, and informed consent rights. So as I repeat, this is happening, this lack of transparency and poor participation spaces happens in most of the cases, and it's happening in cases in the global north. For instance, the cases in Spain, Sweden, even the US, these are elements that have been mentioned. And of course, we also find this in Chile, Madagascar, India, Kenya, Malawi, and many other cases. So this is a common to the way we see the expansion of the earth element frontier is taking place globally. Under the discourse of climate urgency, we see how this project advanced with little conversation with local communities. So I would like to highlight some final remarks. The map documents how earth element supply chains are rapidly expanding, generating significant environmental and social impacts and conflicts across the globe. And while the central question for industrialized economies has remained how to urgently secure the provision of critical materials, the map that you will be able to access documents the unsustainable and unjust distribution of environmental, social, and health burdens on communities across rare earth elements global supply chains. And I would like to note that this, while we are documenting and discussing today what's happening with rare earth elements, I invite you to access the Environmental Justice Atlas, and you will find similar and concerning trends for other critical materials. So at the end of the report, and I would like to also share with you today, we also raise the attention and the need to make urgent questions, such as how can we ensure a transition that takes biophysical limits into account, a question that we see not made in many political debates nowadays. How can we envision environmentally just and sustainable energy transition and digitalization processes that do not exacerbate unjust and unsustainable practices or violate human rights? How can we challenge and rethink energy demand scenarios? How can we rethink how to design products so they last long, and they can be more easily recycled and reused? How can we develop energy transition policies that do not push back environmental, social, or participation rights in the name of climate urgency? So these are some of the results of our mapping process that I invite you all to read, to access. Here you have the links and also in the chat. And we can keep on the conversation today or in the future if you want to write to any of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mariana. And I'm not sure, we weren't able to see actually any of the slides other than the first slide, which,
Wow.
So maybe in the Q&A, there might be an opportunity for you to share again if there's some slides you wanted to show us. Or it's a very clever strategy to get people to look at the map directly. It serves as a teaser, and I think it encourages all of our viewers to click on that link and go and explore the map itself. We're going to turn now to two cases that are highlighted in the map, and Mariana gave us a wonderful overview of what this map contains. We're going to start with Lee Tan, who is the policy coordinator at Aid Watch Australia, and she leads the campaign Stop Linus. She has also contributed as a researcher to the EJAtlas. I would probably, this is redundant at this point, but we do have translation in Spanish and in French, and there's interpretation button down at the bottom, which you can click. And for those of you who joined later, we are holding to a 10-minute period for each of the presentations. And at the 9-minute mark, I turn my camera on. And at the 10th minute, I show the green card. So that's an explanation for my conduct. And with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Lee Tan. Thank you, Lee, for joining us today.
Hi, yes, thank you, John, for the introduction. Now I need to find out how I'm going to turn the slide on because I'm using a new package, and sorry about that. Can you see my
I think if you go to screen, if you go to slideshow up at the top and click slideshow.
I know, but it's covered by the icons from Zoom.
Oh, you can.
So I don't know what to do.
You can minimize the icons from Zoom so that you can see, or even.
I'm trying. It's already minimized, and the minimized panel appear on the top. Gosh, sorry, I should have tested this earlier. Because there should be another section for slide. Yeah, you see the minimize icons just sits right above the panel, and I'm not, look, I'll stop share and then turn it on and then get back. Sorry about that, everyone, technical hitch. Okay. I'm having the same problem again. I turned it on before, but.
Do you want me to switch to Vola and then you can try to resolve this?
Yeah,
offline?
well, I try to turn it on, but because the minimization appear at the top. I can't get back to it. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I don't have access to your computer screen, so
I know.
but Claudia says she can share the screen for you, and you can just tell her
Yeah, maybe she
when to
should do that
advance
because I have
advance the slide.
problem putting it on. Yeah, sorry. I'll go very quickly. Yeah, you can pass on to Vola and then I'll get back to it. Sorry.
Oh, no, I think it's ready. So you can go
Oh, okay,
forward
good.
now.
Thank you. Yep. Second slide, please. I'm going to talk about an Australian company that has got a very interesting supply chain. This company mined the rare earth mineral in a fairly remote mine in Mount Weld in Western Australia. And this mineral is then concentrated and trucked to, trucked to the port of Fremantle, some 1,000 kilometers away, to then ship to the port of Kuantan in Malaysia. And that's about 4,000 kilometers, by, container vessels. And there it has a plant called the Lynas Advanced Material Plants. And this plant's been operating since 2011. And as Claudia's mentioned earlier, the secrecy around this, surrounding this kind of project, it happens in Malaysia as well. In 2011, people found out about this plant already under construction through the New York Times magazine article, and they were shocked that such a big scale project has already underway without any public knowledge, let alone consultation. And subsequently, there has been a big protest from the public in Malaysia. So anyway, at the Kuantan plant, the rare earth ores, concentrate are then processed through very heavy chemicals reaction and also at high temperature into rare earth oxides, carbonates, and so on and so forth. So they're not refined into rare earth elements as yet. And these oxides are then sold to countries like Japan, Vietnam, and even China, particularly China, for further refinement. Next slide, please. Next slide. So this plant was constructed about 100 hectares, was clear from a pristine peat forest. As you can see, a relatively intact forest has then been denuded into a industrial site. Next slide. Next slide, please. And this is what it is today. It becomes, an area packed with radioactive waste, which is the white, reddish color piles of waste, and also even more like 3 or 4 million tons of what they call gypsum waste, which is also contaminated with radionuclides and chemicals. And next slide. Next slide, please. And can you go back to the previous one? Anyway, Lynas ore is actually very high in thorium concentration. Apart from the one in Greenland, Lynas ore contain the second highest thorium concentration when compared with other mineral ores in the world. Now, this site in front, the reddish soil that is waterlogged, was actually a peat land. Peat, as some of you may know, is very rich in organic matters, and they actually burn underground because of the methane released from the decaying process. So Linus is using this area now to build a radioactive waste dump, which is totally unsafe and also unscientifically sound, and is against international guidelines. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So as I explained, Linus, if you look at it, the second entry from the bottom, Australia, Linus thorium content is actually quite high as compared to other countries. And next slide. And thorium, as I have researched, is a carcinogen. It is radioactive, and also it has a very long half-life, stretching to 14.5 billion years, which means it is permanently radioactive, posing hazards to the surrounding environment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so yeah, and surrounding the area was once pristine mangrove along the river of Balok, and it is only 3 kilometers from the South China Sea. And this area used to be a very rich fishing ground for local community. All of this has now been contaminated, but nothing is done by the government, and people have been very poorly informed or misinformed that everything is safe and that Linus operation is has zero harm on their food chain and also on their environment. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As yeah, and these are the traditional area which people have used to collect seafood, particularly shellfish. And you know, there's been no data released on how badly some of these you know, food has been contaminated beyond a few data that we have cited on Linus environmental impact assessment for the radioactive waste dump. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So because of this, there have been huge protests in Malaysia, particularly around 2011 to 2015. In the last few years, most of the advocacy efforts been focusing on trying to stop the radioactive waste dump from being approved, and also trying to take the government to court for not adhering to their original license condition to compel Linus to remove the waste from Malaysia. Next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide, Claudia. Okay, yeah. And a diverse, you know, type of tactics been used. Yeah, the people in Malaysia protested in the country, came to Australia, went to Linus AGM, did speaking tour, etc., etc. So we have used different methods to try and raise awareness, to try and highlight, yeah, the problems yeah, associated with Linus operations in Malaysia. And next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, and Linus, another branch of operation, is just being constructed in Kalgoorlie, Boulder, which is in Western Australia. This plant is still not in operation, despite having been approved several years ago. And that shows how in Australia, the standards are a lot more stringent, and the monitoring by the state government or the state environmental protection agency is much higher, and therefore, you know, they have yet to start operation. Whereas in Malaysia, it only took the company a couple of years to get its license. Next slide. Next slide. Turn the slide. Okay, and there is, well, Linus has got quite a few millions of dollars. I can't remember how much. I think a total of $50 million from Pentagon to construct a heavy rare earth separation plant in Texas. There's not a lot of information available on that beyond Linus securing, some land in a location in Texas. Yeah, and much of that is to try and produce weapon industry required heavy rare earths. Next slide. Next slide, please. So, we at EJAtlas and also the people in Malaysia, they're not against rare earth mining or rare earth processing, but it can be done with much higher standard and also with greater responsibility. Not, picking a country like Malaysia, where generally, by and large, citizens are repressed. Yeah, there've been many stories of many incidences of human rights abuse in Malaysia, which I do not have time to go into details for. If Linus had stuck, basically operate out of Australia, where it can have, higher standard of production and waste management, particularly the radioactive waste management, then there won't be any issue. Well, at least, the issues can be much better rectified and also managed. Unlike in Malaysia, where, a unsafe radioactive waste dump will be used to contain the waste, but good enough only for 20 years. When this waste in Australia will require at least 1,000 years of scientific reliability of no contamination to the environment. But in Malaysia, the government has just approved a design from Linus that will only be good enough to keep the waste contained for 20 years. So, there are many issues around this. The details will be in the EJAtlas map once it's being updated. And thank you very much. And apologies for the technical hitch at the beginning. Okay,
thank you, Lee. That was wonderful. And thank you also for joining us at this time, because for me, it's midday here in the United States, but for you, it's 3 o'clock in the morning or something like that.
It's 4 o'clock now.
4 o'clock now. So thank you so much for staying up late, or maybe even getting up early to join us.
Bye.
If you have questions for any of the presenters, you can put them in the Q&A, and if you're lucky, they'll even answer them before we get to the Q&A section. So you can introduce yourself in the chat, tell us where you're from, but please reserve your questions for the Q&A section. Our next presenter is Vola Andriamana Tenensoa from CRAAD-OI, which is a nonprofit independent Pan-African organization based in Madagascar. And Vola is a human rights specialist and the current program director of CRAAD-OI. And thank you, Vola, for joining us today. And if I know you joined us a little late, so at 9-minute mark, I turn my camera on. At the 10-minute mark, I show a little green card as a reminder. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hand it over to you.
Thank you, John, and hi to everyone. I just want to check first if you can see presentation when I change it.
We see the first slide, but if you hit the next one, let's see if that works.
No, you cannot see then.
Okay.
No,
we got it. We got the second slide, but it's not in slideshow mode. but it's okay.
Okay.
You can keep it in
I
that.
think it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Thank you, John. So today I'm going to talk about the rare earth exploitation challenge in Madagascar, but rather from the climate justice and energy transition perspective. So Madagascar is among the most affected countries by the impacts of climate crisis, despite its least contribution to such situation. With its wealth in terms of biodiversity and its natural resources, Madagascar is also among the countries which are most solicited for so-called climate solutions, such as carbon offset projects, REED plus ones, which have in fact only aggravated the violations of the rights of affected communities, as well as the social and ecological injustice suffered by the Malagasy population for decades. As 80% of our population is rural, people depend heavily on the land and various natural and productive resources, such as water and forests. And now, in the name of energy transition, Madagascar is on the front line as a sacrifice zone for rare earth extraction as well. One of the largest rare earth mining projects that communities are fighting against is located in the country's northern region, as you can see here, a region which is known for its cash crops such as coffee, pepper, cloves, cocoa, but above all, vanilla. Local communities there have no need for such mining projects for any kind of development or so-called development that would be brought by this project. And this rather threatens the livelihoods of the affected and neighboring populations, as well as the region's exceptional terrestrial and marine biodiversity. Given that rare earths mining are known to be very ecocide, with proven risks of serious impacts on the human rights of affected communities, in Madagascar, these impacts will be worsened by the weakness of the governance system, including a large-scale corruption at different levels, the absence of correct mechanisms of protection of communities' rights, the absence of monitoring and control systems, etc. The same applies for precarious access to basic services such as healthcare, while the risks associated with pollution and radioactivity are extremely high, as we saw with what's happening in Malaysia. There are also the various impacts on human rights that are inevitable given the location of the mining project, including land grabbing through forced evictions, loss of means of subsistence, cultural rights, right to health, and so on. And it seems that Madagascar's ionic clays are similar to those mined in southern China. So the extraction is likely to be similar as well, which means through on-site leaching. But although considered less harmful, this method is controversial because its environmental impacts are far from negligible, and it does not completely avoid a destruction of vegetation cover, while necessarily leading to soil pollution and potentially groundwater pollution as well. We also have another rare earth mining project in the southern part of the country, a region which already suffers a lot from climate change impacts, where we have drought with a critical food insecurity situation, while we know that rare earth mining also requires the use of a huge amount of water. So what are community responses towards that situation? At the local level, communities went down to the streets to protest against this rare earth mining, and they still continue doing so until now. They try to raise everyone's awareness of the situation, including traditional leaders. They met parliamentarians to explain and warn them on the impacts of such mining. Online and written petitions were launched and submitted to the President of the Republic, with no response so far. And I said they haven't stopped. They continue the struggle until today. Along with that, a national campaign on climate justice and human rights, led by the youth and women groups, have been implemented that also targets rare earth mining. Protest actions were organized in several regions of the country, and cooperation with regional and international allies was developed, like integration within the rare earth group, the partnership with organizations like Inclusive Development International, IDI, which led us to some significant results, because so far we managed to fight back 2 companies who wanted to operate this mine, a German one and another one registered in Singapore. But today there are new ones coming from Australia and Great Britain, who have just acquired the project again. But anyway, a strong media campaign, as well as the national and international advocacy actions are also conducted, not only on rare earth mining, but on the global stake of energy transition and climate justice. Yes, because when we demand climate justice, we cannot let the question of real impacts of energy transition of the global south ignored, because this is perceived as a big threat from our perspective. This is perceived as a new form of colonialism, but you see, disguised as opportunities for economic growth for the global south, while we will only benefit from the social and environmental adverse impacts, whereas the global north and other big countries will benefit from clean and green energy. Clean energy for who, by the way, and energy transition for who? And it serves as an excuse for the global north not to comply with their international commitments, because yes, they sign agreements and they say they will reduce their pollution, gas emissions, and so on. But what they do is transfer the pollution to our countries, to our communities, and that now under the name of imperatives of energy transition. Is that climate justice? No, of course. Energy transition should not replicate or create new violations of human rights, social and ecological injustices, as Lee said earlier. There has to be some kind of coherence somewhere at some level. So I think I will end it there, John. Thank you.
Thank you, Vola, very much. And thank you for being admirably concise as well. And I'd like to remind folks that if they have questions for Vola or any of the other speakers, there's a Q&A section at the bottom. And all of the previous questions, with one exception, the one that put in the chat, have been answered, but we can revisit some of those questions in the Q&A as well. At this point, I'd like to introduce Alphonse Perez. Alphonse is part of the Observatory and Debt Observatory and Globalization team researching energy and climate policies. Alphonse, I'm going to pass it over to you. You know the format right now. I come on at 9 minutes and I'll wave a green card at you if you get to 10. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, perfect. Can you hear me? Yes. So
Yes.
I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if it works. So you should see my presentation right now. And is the slides moving?
Yes, it's working.
It's working? Okay, perfect. So thanks, John, and hello. It is a pleasure for me to be part of this event. As John said, my name is Alphonse Perez. I work in the Observatory Detecting Globalization based in Barcelona. It's one of the organizations that push for the rare earth elements map. And today I'm going to just give like a short presentation of this global dynamics behind the green transition related to rare earth elements. So I just have 10 minutes, so I'm just going to have like time for driving like general ideas. Here is a kind of a presentation of our team. We are an organization based in Barcelona, as I said, and we work for mobilization and social transformation, and we mix research and advocacy work. So if you want to know more about that, about us, just go to this website, www.odyg.cat. And as we're going to share all the presentations, I just want to just here highlight the last publications we did, and especially this one called The Mine, the Factory, and the Store, that is going to be part of my presentation right now. Okay. Let's see. For example, John has already mentioned the rare earth extraction right now. How is the situation, and what is the present history? You know? So we passed from dominance, the U.S. dominance, to Chinese dominance, an overwhelming Chinese dominance right now. Nowadays, so we passed from the rare earth epicenter in Mountain Pass in California to a Bayanovo in Inner Mongolia, China, and this has for sure some implications. I just give you one example of that. In the year 2011, China decided to reduce the rare elements exports in order to focus on domestic production of technologies, and they succeed. But then the prices of magnets, neodymium, praseodymium magnets increased by 5 times just in 6 months. I have just here a graph that explained it. So if you have this predominance, if you have this dominance, you have the ability to corner the market. What else? What about projections? What about forecasting? Here I put like 3 reports that project the future demand, not only for rare elements, but for critical raw materials in general. The one from the Q11 University, the one from the World Bank, and the one from International Energy Agency that I want to explain a little bit. The International Energy Agency says that just in 2 decades, from 2020 to 2040, if we want to go for this sustainable development scenario, so we want to reach the Paris Agreement, we'll have to multiply the rare elements mining by 7. So that means a lot of new mines and increasing production of existing mines. So it means the impacts that Lee and Bola already explained. But why we need to expand extraction? Why do we need to expand mining? This is because we are literally linking the green transition to technologies. So as the green transition is based in technology, and these technologies need these ingredients, part of them are rare elements. So we have like a sustainable development scenario, but we need more mining in order to fit the objectives. What else? yeah, that's a graph that John already explained a bit. So the projections are for sure to a growing tendency of rare earth elements is actually an unprecedented demand. Green technologies right now are almost 30% of global demand. Sometimes it's very difficult to detach green technologies to digitalization, especially in Europe, that we have like this double agenda, the twin agenda. It's green and green transition and digitalization. But green technologies are only the third percent of global demand. But what about consumer electronics, robotics, and right now military devices in a time that the national budgets for defense are just increasing a lot? They are demanding rare earth elements as well. So, I mean, this unprecedented rare earth demands is driven by the green technologies, but not only by the green technologies. And then we have in the other side the possibility of urban mining, so the recycling these elements, or to develop sub-technologies that don't need this intensive demand of rare earth elements. But I have to say that these take time for sure. So to develop sub-technologies, it takes time. And to develop this sector, this industrial sector of urban mining, it takes time. It is in all the, for example, the EU documents, but there is no like a clear budget to increase the urban mining. So again, we are pointing this unprecedented demand of rare earth elements. What about the relevance? I mean, this sentence has just summarized a bit the relevance of these rare earth elements. For Ursula von der Leyen, lithium and rare earth will soon be more important than petroleum and gas. This was part of her statement in the State of the European Union in September 2022. So she put, and the EU itself put at the same level the importance of lithium and rare earth and then the petroleum and gas. And how is it the global chain in rare elements and green technologies? So there are different starting positions. We have, for sure, I already described this dominant position of China because of they start to promote these green technologies, the dominance of these technologies since 2001, the 5-year plans, the 10th 5-year plans. So they take advantage of that. And then we have an advantage position of the United States because they have like, they have domestic mining. I'm just describing, it's not that I do agree, I'm just trying to describe what is the situation in global supply chain and global value chain of the rare earth elements. And they have like clear policies like Inflation Reduction Act, where they want to develop like an domestic industry. They have like very strong monetary policies, and yeah, in terms of compared to the EU, that is actually his position right now is as an importer. So we are depending on energy, depending on technologies, and depending on critical raw materials. So the position is a kind of a dependent on the external relations. But the EU itself has developed some policies like Next Generation EU with 750 billion euros in the transformation, the green transformation of industry. Inflation Reduction Act is 365 billion, so a lot of money in this green transformation. And now we are developing this policy of Critical Raw Materials Act and Net Zero Industrial Act. Here I have some graphs of this dominant position of China. So in 2019, the extraction of rare earth elements was 60%. China had the 60% of the global share, and about processing the 87%. But it's not only this; it's just if you go to all these green technologies and components of these green technologies, China has more than 50% of almost all the green technologies components, and sometimes 80 or 90%. So it's a really dominant, he has a really dominant position. I think with these three actors, there is a competition again. So green transition could mean like to reach net zero, or to reach like a different level, or maybe could be linked to climate justice, but it is not. At the global level, it's just a competition of a niche of a market, you know, and it's very clear on how is the Inflation Reduction Act is acting, or how this Critical Raw Materials Act is acting against this dominant position of China. And last but not least, for me, the most important one is the clear subordinate position of mainly global South countries. Of course, there are always promises of industrialization in Bolivia, in Chile, in Argentina, in Zambia, in many places. But at the end of the day, they have to serve as a cheap providers of critical raw materials. And they can be forced of that with macroeconomic trends like, for example, debt or the so-called trade and investment treaties. But it is important to understand that they start from a subordinate position. I mean, it was really clearly described by Lee and Bola and all the cases that Mariana was mentioning at the beginning. And last but not least, important in the EU as well, is this mix of green transition and defense and security agenda. So we have this kind of campaigns that you are Euro, where they are mixing the so-called EU values with technologies and with security. And I think it is relevant because the access to rare earth elements or critical raw materials in general is not only a question of green transition, but security. And it has a lot of implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Alphonse. And thank you all for this, extraordinarily useful and informative panel. We have about a half hour to answer your questions. I would, again, encourage people to type their questions into the Q&A at the bottom. We did get one question in the chat, which I think would be interesting to start the conversation with. And that is one from David Robinson. Are there any case studies of any mining operations, extraction and or processing, that have a relatively good record in terms of environmental justice and human rights? If so, where can they be accessed? And as we've explained, our map is generally about some of the worst cases. And so this question is, do we have any counterexamples that we can point to and to maybe even held up in an exemplary light as a model? Does anybody want to take a crack at that question?
I can probably share my understanding. The Mao Pass mine in California is still in operation, although, yeah, and that's quite a full supply chain from mining to separation into rare earth oxide. I'm not sure if the final refinement is done at Mao Pass in California. So I mean, before in the past, Mao Pass used to contaminate the groundwater, but I think in the night, I can't remember here, when Molly Cobb started, they've actually spent quite a lot of money to improve the system, to make sure that it is a zero waste and zero pollution type of operation. But because it could not compete with the cheap Chinese rare earth products, it has gone bankrupt. And now it has been, revamped again by another company. Maybe you know more than that than I, John. Yeah, that's all I know.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Yes, it's true that there were several legal suits against Mountain Pass to force it to actually close it down as a result of environmental contamination. And the company at least argues that it has met those new environmental requirements in order to restart operations. But perhaps Mariana or Alphonse or Vola, do you have anything to add either about Mountain Pass or about any other operations around the world?
Just to say that I don't have a specific example of a good operation, but I think it's interesting to think that it's important to understand this very sensitive project in a specific context. So when we are talking about mining in cloud forest or deep sea mining or areas that are particularly wet, so there's specific elements of a context that makes projects particularly difficult to manage all the challenges related to waste and wastewaters and so on. And I think in the case of earth elements, it's this presence with radioactive elements adds a new dimension to the different risks and as hazardous waste that have to be managed. And so I think these are some particularities of earth elements. It's also interesting to highlight that earth elements are primary resources, but also secondary. So now there's projects that are starting to consider, like in Brazil and also in Madagascar and in other countries, to extract also earth elements in addition to other minerals that have been extracted. So there's like many different projects being discussed nowadays, but I don't have a specific project to point. But maybe I think the particularities of earth elements that we have mentioned raise some particular concerns about where and how to mine and process and also recycle these very specific materials.
Thank you, Mariana. And that actually points to perhaps a useful follow-up for us on this issue, is to compile a list of questions, at least, that should be raised about siting, about the environment within which mining and processing takes place, as well as perhaps some better practices, if not best practices, when it comes to considerations of community consent, in consideration of the radioactivity that is associated with mining and processing. So a number of questions that we could look into as a follow-up to this particular project. There was a question that I thought was quite interesting that's now in the Q&A from Maciel Valladares. Is there a projection for rare earth element demand under potential degrowth scenarios? So of course, the maps, the graphs that Alphonse and I shared about demand and that Mariana talked about were basically about growth. I mean, a growth in demand based on a growth in use of cars, of windmill, and kind of exponential use of electricity to power everything. So what about degrowth scenarios in which we actually have reduced energy consumption? Have there been any studies or any projections about rare earth use in degrowth scenarios?
I don't know if maybe Alphonse or other. Alphonse, do you have?
No, I have to say no. It's a very good question, but I don't have this kind of forecast for a kind of touching the economics structure. So I mean, when you go to the International Energy Agency or any of these bodies, they always want to keep the 3% of growth, of economic growth. This is untouchable. And then from there, from this starting point, you do your projection. So for sure, we need this kind of scenarios, because what we are saying here is even if we have best practices, we are multiplying by 7 the extraction. So the impacts are going to be there. So even with the best practices, I mean, so the point is how we can drive, if we put like really, as Bola said, you know, this question of energy for whom and human rights in the center of our policies, we have to develop scenarios that maybe start to question the model of production and consumption. But the International Energy Agency won't do that. I know, for example, some I'm sure that Mariana knows more than me, but some researchers in the Universidad de Valladolid here in Spain, that they are analyzing the growth scenario always, because like this you can just have like an example of how we can fit this kind of I mean, all the environmental impacts and things like that. How we can take that into account and then organize the demand, and not the other way around, you know, to organize the demand or the offer and then see how it fits in these human rights issues or things like that. So maybe Mariana wants to share more info.
No, maybe just to say that we also have to challenge what type of energy transition we want or we envision in this different approach, because we are mostly talking about electrical transition, and then energy transition could mean different things in different places. In some places in Latin America, some communities are recovering indigenous technologies or local, or really thinking about their energy uses and try to rethink how they can do a transition, but doesn't imply maybe panels or windmills, or maybe it's about different technologies and a different approach. So I think if we are also stuck in this very specific way of understanding the energy transition, which is an electrical transition, I think we will be facing a problem of supply maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10, maybe in 50, maybe. So we do see there's a peak metal. There's some studies that show that we are in different speed approaching the peak of the access to different minerals and metals. So the question is not if, but is when. So maybe we need to ask like deeper questions and I think deeply challenge a specific approach to energy transition.
Excellent, thank you. And as many of you know, there are lots of campaigns on the production side, but at least in my opinion, unless we have something on the consumption side, you know, we're never going to get this, we're never going to solve this problem. And much of the demand is coming from the global north. And so it really is incumbent upon global north countries to address this question of consumption. There is a question that naturally comes from that, which I want to bring us to. But before I do that, I just want to identify something that Casey Bartram pointed out in the chat, and that is that Earthworks has done some work on better practices on mining. They're not necessarily best practices, we're not there yet, but they're better practices. So that maybe can serve as part of our follow-up as well. There's a question in the chat about urban mining. Urban mining, of course, is a nice way of basically saying recycling, finding ways of recovering materials that have been used already in solar panels, windmills, electric cars, obviously lithium-ion batteries. And urban mining is, of course, is a component of the EU Strategic Mineral or Raw Materials Act, and it's a big issue here in the United States. But are there any studies about the results of urban mining and whether that can reduce the pressure on greater and greater production quotas for rare earth elements?
Okay, this is another interesting question, because I mean, it's like I could say on a starting industry right now, almost in Europe. I don't know how is it in the US. There is a plan in Belgium, and there is that has some like, it was created a few years ago, but right now it's just and as I said, on a starting sector of industrial sector. But what we see, maybe I said that before, is that for example, in the Critical Raw Materials Act, we've seen an increase of the percentage of the human mining from 15 to 25% as an objective, but then there is no clear budget on that. So if you don't help right now companies or startups to work on human mining with public money, they will not do that, because right now, as a starting point, the value cost of the secondary extraction is quite expensive in relation with the primary extraction. So we need like public help or public proposals for human mining. And we as ODG, we did a study about the possibilities of human mining in Barcelona, in the city of Barcelona, in the municipality of Barcelona. As cities concentrate a lot of people, and part of the energy transition is going to happen in cities, they have like a direct responsibility on, you know, the demand, but also in recycling critical raw materials. And this is just like a state of art of the human mining. But what we realized is that a city of like Barcelona, 1.5 million people living there, is not enough. So we need like a bigger territory in order to just to combine all these technologies and to create this human mining factories or plants, you know? And there are some difficulties in the production side, in the design, you know, how the products are designed, because they are the alloys, for example, are very complicated to separate minerals or the rare earth elements from another elements. So it's costly economically, but also environmentally and energy intensive. So we have to, again, go to the first step, to how the products are designed.
Just to highlight that rare elements are present in many digital technologies in a way that is very difficult to separate, because they are like merged together, used like in phones, computers. So these elements have been key in like many of the very early digital developments of these years, like compact computers, phones, and so on. So it's really difficult, and as Alphonse was mentioning, in terms of energy, resources, and also the polluting waste that is related with this process. So recycling rare elements, it's not clean if we consider the way digital elements are built today. So we really need to rethink products from zero in many cases.
Excellent, thank you. And there's a link in the chat to a study of urban mining in Barcelona. It's in Catalan. I don't know if ODG is planning on translating it into other languages, but for those of you who speak Catalan, that I'm sure is an excellent resource, though my Catalan is weak and I have not read it. I want to, in the last 10 minutes, give everybody an opportunity to say some final remarks. And I would encourage Mariana and Alphonse in their final remarks to address a last question that's in the Q&A, and that is about the Critical Raw Materials Act. It's a European piece of legislation being crafted as we speak. And Maida Ibrakovic wants to know what would be your key points or arguments around the Critical Raw Materials Act, and what will be the concrete implications for Global South countries with its implementation, as well with China. So think about that, Alphonse and Mariana. And I'm going to go first to Vola and see if you have any final comments, Vola, about what you've heard today, or about some of the questions that people have asked, or maybe just any final thoughts you might want to offer. Actually, I'm not sure Vola is still with us, so I'm going to ask Lee. Lee, do you have any final comments to make?
Yeah, what I'm really concerned about is the greenwashing. by the mining companies. Lynas particularly has invested quite heavily, both in trying to appease communities immediately around its plant, sponsoring, school events, paying for research at local university in Malaysia. So, because of that, there's no critical voices from that mainstream in this kind of global South country. I mean, in the West, we can, to some extent, do independent study and be analytical and critical. But in the global South, that kind of capability is actually limited because of funding, because of government control of the universities, and so on and so forth. So I think that's another area that needs to be explored. The public relation, the kind of bias science that comes out, from this kind of company-sponsored studies. And it adds another layer of environmental injustice, hiding the truth from the public, and also aiding the marketing of the rare earth elements when its supply chain is problematic and totally ungreen and unclean. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you, Lee. Mariana, your final thoughts?
Thank you, John. I think we have mentioned most of the main points, but I would like to stress the need to really approach the demand side, something that was missing last week in the Raw Materials Week, where the Raw Materials Act was approved very quickly, in a way that it has also, there has been lots of concern in communities and social movements, because the Raw Materials Act is not being very open in the prior informed consent rights of indigenous communities. And there's a lot of concern about how the climate urgency and all this pressure to advance quickly in the energy transition is speeding up some stages of the permit processing, in a way that there's concerns about how environmental protection will be taken care of, and how the participation rights we will also take into account. These processes are speed up. So there's many concerns, and what we are seeing on the ground is already a lack of respect of communities' rights, participation rights, and even compliance with environmental regulations in many places of the world. And I have to say, this is not only about the Global South. We have also documented many cases in like the Bear Lodge in the US, but also many other cases in Europe itself, in Sweden, in Spain, where communities are pointing to similar concerns regarding lack of participation, lack of transparency with environmental documents and environmental information of the projects. So I think the map is only at the beginning of a process that we see is accelerating in terms of pressures to advance the extracting frontier, the processing frontier. And I think it's really important that from the Environmental Justice Atlas, we think it's important to keep on track of all these projects and to make them visible, so we can make accountable companies and governments for all these human rights violations and abuses, and to try to make things, doesn't let this unseen for the public. So I will highlight this.
Thank you, Mariana. And before we give Alphonse the final word, just a couple of more comments in the chat, a report on urban mining in France, and then a similar one in Spanish from Ecologistas en Acción. Alphonse, over to you.
Good. Let me say, John, that I received a message from Bola. And she said, I was ejected again due to power cut. See to what extent our energy poverty is. It's quite paradoxical, and it explains very well these differences of how these countries are like serving the green transition of global north, but they have no like regular power supply, you know. So I mean, she was highlighting that, you know. She said, please say that to me, and apologies.
She actually is now back on, so
Really?
I'll give her the final word after you've given.
Okay,
a
perfect,
comment.
perfect. I'm glad to see that. So that's it about the Critical Raw Materials Act. At the end of the day, as Mariana said, it is a tool, you know, to accelerate the process of mining and to accelerate the process of authorization of mining. Yeah, in domestic mining, but also has like a lot of implication of external dimension, you know, that it maybe because it's going to be driven by the global gateway proposal. But as I said in my presentation, Europe is really has a big dependence on energy, materials, and technology. So each of these pieces of legislation has always like external dimension and external implications, and we will be following that. We will see how is this tool against the dominance of China, and as a response of the IRA in the US, how it's going to affect the global south and our territories as well.
Thank you, Alphonse. Vola, if you could join us, if you have any final comments you'd like to make in the last couple of minutes. And as you turn on your camera and unmute yourself, I'll also alert folks to, in the chat, you can evaluate this this webinar with the EU survey function. Vola, are you able to, or yes.
Thank you, John. I'm able to speak, but I'm in the dark. That's what I told Alphonse earlier. To which extent our energy poverty is, and though we are faced to this kind of challenges for other people's energy transition. So this is the kind of injustice that we should be fighting for. I don't have much to say, John. I think I've already said what I wanted to say. I mean, we actually need a genuine climate justice, a genuine just transition, and all these adverse impacts on the global south have to be really thought thoroughly. If not, we will do the same mistakes again and create the same injustice again. Thank you all for having been here.
Thank you, Vola, and thank you for joining us. And there's no starker representation of climate injustice than to have our participants in the global south be in the dark, and for us in the global north to be in the light. Toward that end, we will continue our work on monitoring rare earth element extraction and processing. Please go to the map and look around at the various case studies, incorporate them in your activism and your research, and we will follow up with a variety of different applications for the map and ways of transforming this information into better policy and better results on the ground. I'd like to again thank all of the participating organizations, all of the panelists, and of course, everyone in the audience for attending. And then one final thank you before we say goodbye, and that is to our interpreters who have followed everything and translated it expertly for an hour and a half. They must be tired. They want to say goodbye too. So everybody, thank you again, and we look forward to continuing to work with you in the future.
Thank you, John, as well.
Bye.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Gracias, Bola, Lee, Mariana, John, and all participants.